o'clock. So let's start for the last session of the last day of this symposium. And I hope you had a good rest and you could kind of digest what came in, because it's been a very intense symposium in my eyes. Very good. So today is going to be a short day, which is also fortunate. And we're going to start with a keynote, then we'll proceed with parallel panels, and then we'll have a forum again. And we should stop at around 5 o'clock, maybe a little later. So I'm very happy to introduce to you the next keynote speaker. It's Professor Maaike Blecker. She is a professor of Theatre and Performance in the Department of Media and Culture at Utrecht University. Her work engages with questions of perception, cognition, and agency from an interdisciplinary perspective, with a special interest in performance, embodiment, movement, and technology. In her research, she combines approaches from the arts and performance with insights from philosophy, media theory, and cognitive science. She wrote the book Visuality in the Theatre that was published in 2008 by Palgraf. And she has been involved in editing a couple of books like Transmission in Motion, the Technologizing of Dance in 2016, Thinking Through Theatre and Performance in 2019. And in 2019, she also organized the Performing Robots Conference in Utrecht, which probably some of you have attended. And she's currently the principal investigator and leader of the project Acting Like a Robot, Theatre as Testbed for the Robot Revolution. And I'm very happy that she is drawing on some resources and sources that are important for me too, like Bresel's work, and that she's going to refer to and build on in her talk. So happy to have you here, and the screen is yours, Maaike Blecker.
Thank you so much. Let me first see if I also managed to deal with technology this way. Yeah, very good. Okay, well, thank you so much for this introduction and also for inviting me to share some ideas here at this digital gathering. It's a real pleasure to be part of this. Of course, I would have loved also to meet everybody live. That is dearly missed, and it somehow spans my whole robot project that started, as I will refer to later on, almost at the beginning of the pandemic, the Acting Like a Robot project. So the pandemic and the robot project are kind of parallel at the moment. And yeah, I'm really excited by a lot of things that I've heard yesterday, seen yesterday and the day before. I hope that I can add something that people will find an addition to what has already been said. Yeah, and in my my presentation, I want to look at a kind of a canonical text for thinking about theater and the use of theater for developing robotics, or a text that marked really a moment in that history 10 years ago. Let me see. Now, should I be able also to? Yeah, there it is. Heather Knight's 8 lessons learned about nonverbal interaction through robot theater. Now, in this text, Knight observes that theater settings may provide a testing ground for robot behavior and for HRI, and she identifies several characteristics of the theater that are also relevant to socializing robots. These include the use of relatable gestures that can clarify activity goals, the fact that embodiment supports affectivity, that the readability of behavior for humans is a better benchmark for design than internal AI, the utility of audience feedback, and that humor may enhance interaction. Knight's observations are not about the highly realistic androids that were the subject of presentations of 2 previous keynote speakers. And the theater that Knight is referring to is not limited to the kind of naturalist, realist, dramatic theater that functions as testbed in their practice. Rather, Knight looks at a broad spectrum of theatrical practices, and her observations apply to a diversity of robotic agents that do not necessarily imitate humans or have human-like shapes. Knight's observations about what lessons might be learned from the theater are tentative. She's hinting in directions in which she assumes more is to be found, and she herself describes the work done by her text as sampling and expresses the hope that her findings may motivate further investigation. And my presentation is a response to her pioneering text from a different moment in time and from the perspective of the theater. And like Knight, I will use theater in a broad sense to indicate also non-dramatic forms of theater, dance, puppet and object theater, live art, and all kinds of types of performance. Like Heather Knight, I will not be looking at androids, but at a broad spectrum of technological agents, including commercially produced robots like Naos and Peppers, robots developed for more specific purposes and contexts, as well as repurposed industrial robots and things that are sometimes referred to as robotic objects, like automatic furniture, Roombas, and lawnmowers. I prefer to speak of technological or robotic agents rather than objects, because I believe that acknowledging their agency or possibility of such agency to emerge is important for reinventing our relationship to these technological entities that increasingly populate our life world. I'm interested in what the theater has to offer with regard to their development, the development of ways of interacting with them, as well as for reconceptualizing notions of the social beyond the human. And I will argue that more than offering practical expertise and knowledge that can be applied to already existing approaches to the development of robot behavior and HRI, important lessons from the theater might be given in how theater invites and contributes to rethinking what actually is developed in developing HRI and how to go about in developing it. And more specifically, my point is that the potential of insights and knowledge from the theater may lay in how they contribute to approaches to HRI that are not, or not first and foremost, a matter of applying insights from the theater to modeling interaction, but of using expertise from the theater and collaborations with theater makers to set the stage for intra-actions of humans and technological agents. Interaction is a term coined by philosopher Karen Barat, with which she wants to draw attention to the primacy of relationships over entities. Now, what she means is that relationships precede and are constitutive of how things come to matter, and of how signification, subjectivity, and agency come about. With her notion of interaction, she just shifts focus from entities and what they do and are towards relations and what they bring about, including how they may bring about signification, subjectivity, and agency. Now, similarly, an approach to HRI in terms of intra-actions acknowledges that signification, subjectivity, and agency do not precede and inform interaction, but emerge from it, and are brought about by the ways in which the design of robotic agents affords humans to relate to them and interact with them. An example that demonstrates this principle is the non-anthropomorphic robot communicating dominance by means of locomotion as developed by Jamie Lee and others. Dominance is not something that can be conveyed by a sign. I'm sorry, probably a lot of sound from here. That's the firemen passing by. Dominance is not something that can be conveyed by a sign or by performing a particular expression, but is a phenomenon that is brought about by ways of relating and manifests itself in how relationships are perceived. Lee and his colleagues investigate how insights from improvisational theater can be used to make a robot move, and by means of movement relates to a human partner in ways that result in the perception of dominance. The movements performed by the robot are not mimicking human movements. What they're using is a very simple robot, a kind of automated footstool, and this very simple robot would not even be able to imitate human movements. Rather, strategies from improvisational theater are used to inform how the robot moves through space, how it takes distance or gets closer, speeds up or slows down. And in doing so, the robot brings about relationships between itself and human users that establishes a sense of dominance in the user. Now, Lee's non-anthropomorphic robots communicating dominance by means of locomotion is an example of how designing HRI is designing emergence. It's an example of how designing HRI is designing the possibility for characters, situations, and events to emerge from the ways in which robotic agents are It's an example of how designing HRI is designing the possibility for characters, situations, and events to emerge from the ways in which robotic agents afford ways of interacting with them, afford interpreting them, and being affected by them. And with regard to designing such possibilities for emergence, a lot of knowledge and expertise can be found in the theater. Now, Heather Knight is not the first and not the only one to acknowledge this potential of knowledge and expertise from the theater for the development of robot behavior and HRI. She refers to Cynthia Brazil, Guy Hoffman, David Liu, and William Smart, as well as the work of various artists, including Louis de Meer. And since 2010, the year in which she published her article, more work has been done by these and other authors, including our esteemed keynote speakers and other speakers at this conference, as well as David Serkin and Wendy Yu, Elisabeth Jochem, Petra Gemeinbuch, Rob Saunders, Jamie Lee, Evelyn Ficara, and many others. Now, if we look at the work that they have been doing, and that they are doing at the intersection of theater and HRI development, it seems that we can make a rough distinction between two different approaches. On the one hand, approaches that take human interaction as a model to develop robot behavior and HRI that mimics human behavior and human interaction, that mimics this as closely as possible, and that uses the theater as a test bed to test out the result. On the other hand, we can see approaches to HRI that, like the example of Lee's robot, communicating dominance by means of locomotion, look at what theater has to offer with regard to bringing about and sustaining interactions between human and non-human agents, and do so in ways that do not necessarily mimic human-human interaction. In these practices, I will argue later on, theater does not so much function as a test bed, but as a third space, a space for interaction and collaboration. And I will come back to that later. Now, looking at how theater features in work that is part of this second category, what can be observed is that in many of these explorations, knowledge and expertise from the theater contributes to approaches to the development of robot behavior and HRI that foreground relationality, situatedness, materiality as important elements of social interaction. Insights from the theater support the development of ways of communicating that are not a matter of codified messages or conventionalized gestures, but result from how technological agents engage humans in interactions that set up relationships between them through which signification, subjectivity, and affect come about. These non-imitative approaches to HRI just draw attention to what Mike Lichtert, Mark Neriks, and Koen Hendricks define as the social dimensions of HRI, and how these social dimensions set the stage for new human technology interactions. Lichtert and his colleagues point out that although in the literature several overviews can be found that list what characteristics social robots should have, such lists do not explicitly define what it is that makes interaction social, nor how social interaction can be differentiated from other types of interaction. Not every exchange of information or performance of a task qualifies as social interaction, What determines what does and what not? Now, in search for a definition, Lichthart and his colleagues turned to philosophy and the social sciences, and in particular to the work of De Jager, Di Paolo, and Gallagher. And this brings them to an understanding of social interaction, quite interestingly, as establishing a coupling between social actors. And characteristic of such coupling is that it is engaging in nature as it starts to take over and acquire a momentum of its own. What is required to establish such coupling is a sense of shared agency and co-regulation, and social interaction ends when the coupling is broken. Now, Lichthart and his colleagues thus present an understanding of HRI as a joint performance, and of designing HRI as designing possibilities for engagement that brings about the coupling that sets the performance in motion. Thus understood, HRI is not merely a matter of designing the looks and behavior of technological agents, but of how the design of their looks and behavior offer possibilities for engagement, how they invite interpretations, trigger associations, bring about affect, and offer possibilities for interaction. And also how they afford interaction to unfold in some ways rather than others. And this is not a matter of what looks and behaviors mean or represent, but what they bring about performatively, their performativity. And with regard to such performativity, again, a lot of expertise and knowledge can be found in the theater. Furthermore, the definition of social interaction proposed by Lichthart and his colleagues, namely that in terms of a performative coupling, is interesting for how it proposes an understanding of social interaction that is not limited to human actors, nor is modeled after human ways of interacting. Their understanding of social interaction allows for all kinds of non-human and non-human-like actors to be part of social interaction, to be part of couplings with humans, and also for the possibility of new modes of sociality to emerge from new couplings afforded by the specificities of new technologies. From this perspective, we may understand current modes of human sociality and the communication to be also co-shaped by the human co-evolution with technology. And we may understand new modes of interaction made possible by current and future technological agents as new steps in this co-evolution. And here again, it seems that theater has a lot to offer to the development of these new forms of communication and sociality made possible by new couplings of humans and technological agents. The presentations yesterday by Thierry Poquet, Chris Ziegler, Martin Riedel, and Pablo Ventura in the roundtable on creative processes and collaborations contain some very interesting examples of couplings of humans and technological agents, and how these set the stage for new modes of interaction and for new modes of sociality to emerge. Their project also suggests that the role of theater in developing these might be less that of a test bed, this phrase used by Knight as well as by quite some other authors, and is more like what Jocelyn McKinney and colleagues after Edward Soya described as a third space. They observe that performance practice helps to construct a space between theory and practice, or where theory and practice can productively merge, a space that is simultaneously material and metaphorical and allows for fluid interactions and embodied explorations. This idea of the third space relates well to how in many projects that explore the potential of expertise and knowledge from the theater for developing HRI, the ways in which theater is brought in is not so much a matter of applying theories to robotics and then test out the result on stage, but rather performative practice serves as a way to activate and externalize tacit knowledge of theater practitioners in order to make it available for interaction with experts from other fields and for joint explorations. An interesting example here is the example with which Jen Parker Starbuck ended her opening 2 days ago, namely the music video created by Boston Dynamic, showing several of their robots dancing. This video was heavily criticized from the field of dance. In particular, by Jessica Raiko, who criticizes the video precisely for how it uses dance as a testbed for Boston Dynamics' capacity to apply expertise from dance to robotics, and to use this to show off the technical prowess of the company in a way that is entertaining. The result, Raiko concludes, is not robot dance. It's not even really about dance. It's about capitalizing on popular depictions of dance and exploiting it to sell these robots to a broad audience by means of what she describes as a cliché grab bag of dance moves like the running man, the twist, a bourrée here, a développé there, and a few other things that make robots look like they're dancing to entertain you. And actually this image of the jumping robot that is in the background at the moment is a direct copy of a dance movement performed by a human dancer in the popular popular musical Billy Elliot. Now, in an interview about the making of the video, the Vice President of Engineering of Boston Dynamics, Aaron Saunders, confirms that indeed the video was meant as an entertaining ad for the company. However, when a little later in the interview, Saunders reflects on what the collaboration with the dancers and the choreographer has brought him, this appears to have very little to do with the dance the robots are made to perform in order to create a nice video. He explains that what actually interests him is the dancers and choreographers thinking about motion and the skills inherent in dancing, like agility, balance, and perception. So whereas the video capitalizes on imposing human dance movements on robotic bodies, what is relevant and useful for him as a robot developer is the skills and expertise involved in the ways of working of the dancer and the choreographer. Skills and expertise that could also have been used to develop robotic capacities for movement that do not imitate human movements, but follow from the robot's own morphology and build on the affordances of its own non-human embodiment. Now, engineers Saunders' interest in the skills of the dancer and the choreographer point to the relevance of skills and tacit knowledge from the field of theater for the development of HRI. And this includes skills to move and make dance, but is not limited to them. It also includes expertise with how to respond to the specificities of particular situations in an improvisational way. How to make actions and interpretations in response to environments, how behavior may intervene in situations, and what this does in terms of affect, emotions, and suggestions and associations. It also includes skills for improvisation, timing, and what might be called embodied intelligence for recognizing possibilities for action and response. An interesting example in this respect is how the Human Robot Interaction startup Hero Futures works with ballet dancer Merritt Moore to develop a more intuitive system of communication between humans and robots based on the dancer's embodied skill for partnering. As you see, this is not about partnering with a humanoid robot, but about what the skills for dance can contribute to develop interaction with radically different robots. Now, such skills and expertise that inform the doing and the making of theater and dance are part of what Tim Ingold describes as thinking through making. Making theater and dance is a doing that is also a thinking. This is not meant to over-intellectualize artistic creation, but rather to argue for an expanded understanding of thinking that can account for what happens in making in terms of a thinking that takes shape in and through materials of various kinds, like bodies, texts, movements, objects, light, sound, and the actions of performers. That involve embodied practices, including rehearsing, writing, choreographing, directing, designing, composing, and performing. Such thinking proceeds through the creation of behavior and compositions of human and non-human agents, text and light, sound and movements in space, successions of actions, reactions over time, the direction of attention, the creation of sensations, rhythm, affect, and emotion. It is a thinking that is inventive, sensitive to what emerges from bringing together different materials and from doing things with them. Now, such thinking making in between robotics and theater was also central to the project that brought me to robotics. And this was the project towards corporeal literate social robots by Petra Gemeinbuch, a project of which I was part. The aim of this project was to socialize a custom-built robot with a non-human, non-zoomorphic body, and to do so through movement. The idea was to invent modes of moving that follow from the specificities of the robotic body and their capacities for movement, and then explore and test out how these movements can be used for developing modes of behaving in specific situations. And in this respect, our approach was similar to a certain extent to embodied design improvisation, as developed by David Sirkin and Wendy Yu. Embodied design improvisation starts from exploring the improvising potential behavior and interaction of robotic objects, often in collaboration with artists like performers, dancers, and puppeteers. These experts, Sirkin and Yu explain, are brought in not to help robots move in human ways, but to invite serendipity and to encourage them to open up and challenge expectations and reveal implicit understandings. Rather than working towards preconceived ways of performing, embodied design improvisation aims for exploration and experiment. And video recordings of the experiments are used to test out how the actions and interactions are perceived. The Towards Corporeal Literate Social Robots project takes a similar approach. The project started from simple, non-human-like three-dimensional shapes like cubes or tubes, shapes that do not have an obvious front nor back, head nor face, nor limb-like structures, and that can be constructed as empty shells, to be animated from within by a dancer. And in collaboration with dancers, a series of movement studies were executed in which dancers inhabited these prototypes to explore their possibilities for movement. Captures of these movement sequences are then used as basis for machine learning by robot prototypes of a similar shape. Now, importantly, even though that it is human dancers animating the prototypes, the movements that result are quite unlike human movements. For these movements do not result from making these shapes move like humans, nor from mapping human movements onto them. Often dancers had to adopt rather unusual and uncomfortable poses to fit into them, and they had to invent new practices of moving from this situation and from what could be done in interaction with the shape that they inhabited. Movement thus resulted from the combination of the shape and how this shape informs bodily posture, possibilities for movements of the dancer, and the manner and extent to which the material of the shapes could respond or not to the movements performed by the dancer. We may consider this a new materialist practice of movement creation, in how instead of projecting existing or imagined movements on matter, movement here is allowed to emerge from material and embodied practice. Prototype and dancer operate as an assemblage, or what Karen Barat terms an apparatus, and in the creation of new post-human modes of moving that, although co-created by humans, cannot be traced back one-to-one to their morphology. Now, in a series of workshops, these material practices of movement creation were used to develop short movement sequences or phrases. And these phrases resulted from exploring possibilities for different ways of moving and for different movement qualities, like speed, intensity, and direction. As such, they were not expressions of pre-existing ideas, but explorations of potential movement articulations that the prototype appeared to be capable of performing. And this was, it was a kind of mapping of retraceable articulations. The communicative potential resides in what combinations of these movements can bring about in situations of communication, how they afford interpretations, ways of enacting responses to them, how they evoke effects, associations, how they trigger the imagination of their human interactors. And this potential was explored in experimental setups in which combinations of movements were tried out. And this picture shows Petra Gemeinbuch, demonstrating one of these robotic objects or robotic agents at the Performing Robots Conference in Utrecht. And now the approach taken in this project demonstrates how ways in which movement can support meaningful HRI is not necessarily a matter of how movement represents ideas, meanings, or feelings, but of what movements can bring about, their performativity. And from this perspective, the question is not how do humans perform certain expressions and how can these be imposed on robotic bodies, but rather the question is what combinations of the movements that a robot is capable of articulating, performing, could bring about the desired effect. Thus not imitation, but imagination is the key. And in this mode of working as developed by Petra, movement articulations function as what Bernard Stiegler, following Derrida, has described as gramme, repeatable and recognizable units that can be combined and recombined that support practices of communication. Derrida introduces this notion of gramme in the context of writing, and in Stiegler's work, grammatization applies to all kinds of processes, by which a material, sensory, or symbolic flux becomes gramme, which broadly conceived can include all matters of technological gestures that maintain their iterability and citationality apart from an origin or any particular context. Seen this way, the alphabet is one example of grammatization, but certainly not the only one. And technologies of all kinds afford the emergence of repeatable and recognizable entities that can be combined and become part of communication and social interaction. Now, the approach developed towards corporeal literate social robots can be considered an example of what Gregory Ulmer has described as applied grammatology, in how it works towards the invention of new machine-based movement phrases that can support meaningful HRI within specific situation. Furthermore, grammatization supports an understanding of these new ways of communicating as next steps in this long history of human-technology interactions. Grammatization offers a perspective on human-technology interactions and HRI as open-ended developments that build on historically and culturally specific ways of perceiving, interpreting, and interacting, while also holding potential for transforming these very practices and taking them in new directions. And Petra's project shows how this requires skills that are characteristic of making as thinking through practice, like sensitivity to the potential of the materials one is working with, the sensitivity to what emerges from doing things with it, and to performativity, to what is brought about in the doing. Now, projects like this one do not ask how theater can contribute to make robots look and behave like humans, but what theater has to offer for exploring and developing what it might mean to act like a robot. And this is also the title of our current project. And in our current project, we investigate this in collaboration with puppet and object theater maker Ulrike Kwade. Her expertise is highly relevant for our project. For what project puppets and robots share is that they're both non-human, non-living entities that are animated in a way. Elisabeth Jochem points out that both robots and puppets invite us to adopt a phenomenal double vision. We know that they're not alive, and yet we're momentarily willing to grant them a life of some kind. Furthermore, puppet and object theater demonstrate that this does not require human likeness. The willingness to grant them a life of some kind is not the effect of their successful mimicking and passing for humans, but of the ways in which their behavior appeals to our imagination and evokes empathy. Now, together with Ulrike Kwade, we explore the fundamental role that movement plays in turning an object, a puppet or a robot, into an agent, and how, to quote Elisabeth Jochem again, kinesis is the new mimesis. And with this expression, Jochem does not refer to movement as the latest means to successfully imitate humans, but rather to how movement provides an alternative approach to achieving a sense of robots having a life of their own. And to achieve this, Jochem observes, we have to leave behind the attempt to mechanically imitate human movements. And she writes, and I'm going to quote her here at length because this is important also for the step that Ulrike took in our project. Traditionally, engineers have approached the task of imitating movement through mechanization, powering the motions of robotic limbs through individual motors or hydraulics located inside the puppet. Because of the tremendous difficulty of reproducing complex movements such as walking or dancing, entertainment robots are often heavily stabilized and equipped with a limited set of pre-programmed gestures. This reduced set of behaviors ensures that the robotic actors are reliable and stable, but the mechanisms involved with replicating the motions make the robots heavy and difficult to work with. Because these robots attempt to realistically mimic facial expressions and refine gestures, their jerky mechanical motions are daring and appear uncanny. Now, Joachim in this text suggests that robots might benefit, that the robot might benefit from incorporated puppet-inspired design choices that are not limited by the need to realistically replicate motions. And actually, this is, of course, an important thing that Ulrike is also an expert in. And why I quoted Joachim at length is that what she describes here is quite literally what Ulrike set out to do in the Acting Like a Robot project. She started to take apart these mechanisms that drive the movement of a robotic body, an industrially produced robotic body, and started playing around with them. Now, the robot in this picture is Ike, and it's one of the NAOs that is part of our project. And this picture was taken at the very beginning of our project, which was also the very beginning of the pandemic. Our project was supposed to launch with a live event on 19 March 2020. Looking back now, we know what a bad day that was for a live event. And these pictures, this one and this one, show Ike in the city as we found it at that time, a city without humans. And we also created a short film that shows this robot doing what we could not do at that time, namely visiting the theater. But shortly after we made these pictures and this short film, Ulrike started working with Ike, and this is what happened then to him. Ulrike quite literally took apart the mechanics and the hydraulics inside the robotic body and rewired the motors that control the movement of its limbs. She rewired the robot in such a way that its movements can now be activated in a decentralized manner by 3 people simultaneously. This results in a radical reorganization of how robotic movements come about, and a way of reorganizing that in some ways plays with how in the Bunraku puppet theater, puppets are also puppeteered by 3 different puppeteers simultaneously. An important difference, however, is that the puppeteers in the Bunraku theater are trained to control movement together, whereas here the distribution of control results in a situation in which none of the puppeteers is in control. Now, so this is where we are at the moment with this robot Ike, who is now used to workshop these new types of robotic control and the performative qualities that emerge from that. And it's not yet clear what this experiment will bring, but it is part of a series of experiments in which new strategies of motion generation, for which we bring together expertise from the puppet theater with robotics. And this series will also include, among others, a KUKA robot puppeteering a giant marionette. Now, to conclude my mapping of ways in which theater has informed and may inform the development of HRI and robot behavior, I will make a short return to the beginning and to the observation that how ways of developing robots and HRI in combination with the theater not merely inform new ways of robotic behavior and HRI, but also inform new ways of developing it. And these new ways of developing, and here I think Ike is an illustration, these new ways of developing are bringing a lot, but also are a challenge. And the challenge that I want to address here is the challenge of creating a productive third space that allows for these interactions to come about in a way that, that is productive to all collaborators. And that's the challenge to negotiate between radical different perspectives and radical different expectations and aims. Ulrike's idea to take the now Ike apart and to rewire it was originally met with shock and by the robot developer that we are working with. He had not imagined that that might be how we wanted to work with his robots. And this kind of confrontations makes me wonder whether there is space for one more way of being inspired by the theater in the development of robotics. And that is maybe the making space for the function of something like a dramaturg in the processes of collaborations between robotics and theater. A dramaturg not in the sense of the author of a dramatic text, but more as it is part of various practices of making theater, where the dramaturgs are also a way of a mediator between different partners, reflectors on what is going on in the practice, pointing out implications and potentials of these practices. So I wonder if, and this is still very tentatively, and that's also why I will end here, but if there might be place for a dramaturgy for devices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maaike. I'll switch back. Wait a second. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation, and we'll have time for questions. The easiest way to do this is if you raise your electric hand, so I cannot overlook you. And maybe I'll start the session with a question that's on my mind all the time. It's about the collaboration and cooperation of artists and technicians, and you touched that at the end of your talk. It's always a sensible theme, as far as I know. So the question is, how much technological know-how do the artists have in your project, and how do they get along with the technicians?
Yeah, really good question. I think that's also where my thinking about challenges comes from. At the moment that we started, Ulrike had zero knowledge of this kind of technology. Of course, she has a lot of practical knowledge of her robots, but not of the programming or of the practical knowledge of her puppets, but not and a lot of technical knowledge about how constructing and creating and making them move, and because she creates her own puppets. And the objects that she uses, but she had no knowledge whatsoever of programming and of the specificities. And that was also what informed her desire to take one apart. And she did that together with people who do have expertise in that field. So it was not merely see how they can kind of dissect it, but it was really also meant to become more informed about how this thing works. And the whole idea of rewiring it is very much informed by how she also thinks about her objects and puppets, in how in how she can make them move and how they work internally. So she in a way set out to explore that with 2 or 3 others involved here. And that differs, I guess, in the various projects in which I have been involved. So in Petra Gemeinbuch's project, that was a project also with a person called Saunders, Rob Saunders in this case, and who created the robots while we were working. So there was a continuous presence of expertise in this field, and also Petra is quite experienced in that direction as well. And for me, that was really the very new thing at that moment, to start thinking in this kind of ways. Yeah.
Thank you. So, other questions? Chris, yes.
Maaike, I have a question. When you said about generating movement material with or by robots, I see most of the time people really trying to go again to the humanoid model in a way. Peter Gemeinberg also worked with the idea of using architectures or cubes or objects, which is actually near to my way of thinking, to generate movement with robots as a part of an architecture of a maybe stage. So what do you think about the idea of movement generation with robots, or with idea of manipulating robots going away from that humanoid model maybe?
Well, yeah, that is what I think is really interesting about Petra's project, and that was for me my entry into being involved in thinking about robots per se. So that has certainly also very much informed my thinking. I find that I found that an extremely interesting proposition that the project had. Like, what if we want to think about the capacities of movement to socialize a non-human object? Let's go as far away as possible. Let's try to socialize a cube. And then there were some experiments also with the tubes and so on. But in the end, it was mainly the cube, and I think there's an enormous potential there, and that actually the nows and the peppers have much less potential because of their shape. Well, I guess that's also what Elisabeth Jochem addresses in her text. You know, this is so much determined by an attempt to copy something of the human, which totally doesn't work that way. And there's also seems to be a kind of a fear of letting go or so, or to think of to open up, to let go that whole shape or that type of movement. Yeah.
I want to add to that, because I saw the presentation in your symposium with Peter Gemeinberg, and it was really near. Everybody was laughing actually about this attempt. Really, it was interesting for me to the more you go away from this humanoid model where you think you need that to create empathy with an object, actually it's the other way around sometimes, I thought. So that was interesting.
Absolutely, that was absolutely, and that was from the beginning. That object was invited so much affect, empathy, interpretations with almost nothing. That was really interesting. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Andrea Bonarini. Andrea, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. Okay. Okay. Yes, actually, we are working since I would say something like 8 years in non-humanoid robots and shaping robots, and we made a kind of pillow moving around, trying to express emotions and doing this kind of things. And I'm very much interested in expressing emotions. So we tried many approaches to try to get the basics of emotional expression from actors and from activities, and also from those kind of representations that are most similar to this kind of things. So I don't know if you know the group Mummenschans. It's a group that is working since 40 years inside shapes, and you don't see humans inside, but you see just shapes expressing a lot of things that are really very much interesting. So it's something that we are looking for. So the basics of motion to express things, which is, I think, very, very interesting in the moment where you change the body. So you don't have a human body and you have a box, you have a rock, you have a pipe, and you have to express these kind of things. I wonder whether there is, if there is anything like a kind of, let's say, a kind of recipe or a kind of set of things that are considered by other people, because I'm reading literature on robotics and social robots, and so, and for instance, I was not aware about this project, And so I wonder whether it's possible, maybe from different backgrounds, try to find something that is more common. I'm working on affecting computing, and it seems that for humans it's not possible to have a really universal dictionary for movement and emotions, and people are more or less agreeing about this kind of thing. So you need many things, but maybe for robots we can understand a box that is sad, or a box that is happy, or something like that. Maybe there is something, and so I wonder whether there are other people working on this kind of things in that background.
Well, I haven't come across the recipe yet, so I have to disappoint you with respect to that. But I'm also not sure if, I guess we have not been looking for kind of universal expressions in this project. We've always considered that what the robot brings about to be also depending on the situation, and so in that sense also very much as a situational and relational phenomenon, and in a way, of course, there is also kind of an openness here that affords a lot of ways of relating without them necessarily being all the same, which is sometimes suggested by the idea of a universal expression of being angry. And in one of the texts I was reading recently, there was somebody claiming that if you would have an actor who would perform being hungry, and you would then capture that with motion capture and that you would then have an expression of being hungry. And then I really wondered if what actor would be able to perform.
No, it doesn't work. So you can read papers where
put it on another body. I mean, there's a kind of a desire or a longing for these universalisms, but I'm afraid that my cultural analysis background is in the way of believing in these kind of things.
Yeah. But anyway, we can understand. So there is something behind that we can understand.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, the question is, can we understand if we are not anthropomorphizing?
Yes, this is
do the gestures have any meaning if they are technological gestures? So how far can we go there?
No, and of course, our experience with movement is very much part of how we interpret whatever movement that we see. But I don't think we can. I think the risk is if you start to say, oh, therefore this is a sign that everybody can read or whatever. We can relate to a lot of things also from how our body is capable of imagining also through this experience of movement. But that's something else than that the sign is universal, or that it is disconnected from the human or something. Yeah.
We're leaving the semiotic. Yes, Esther Fiuco.
Thank you for your presentation, because I didn't know your project, very interesting project. It's a sort of curiosity, because I worked with a cooker robot and a dancer during the last 6 months at the Biorobotic Institute in Sant'Anna, just to find a way to break down the mistrust of the performer in front of an industrial robot. No? Usually dancer has the fear to be blessed or hurt by this kind of robot, non-anthropomorphic robot. So if you in your project, if there any study about the use of specific senses, relation by an guidance control with the touch of the dancer or performer in a preliminary step, just to make up later a relation, a truly common ground, to find an interaction, as you said, from Farenberg glossary, because in some way this kind of experiment with sense, with touch, could be a really powerful tool to really break down the fear of the performer to be hurt by an industrial robot. So if you experimented something like that in your project.
No, we haven't experimented with things like that. We are currently kind of collaborating with an artist from the project. We're collaborating with an artist whose name is Bram Ellens, and he is running a project called Robots in Captivity, which is more a visual art project, but also very much dealing with notions of staging and using staging as a way of framing the appearance and movement and behavior of robots. And several of these industrial robots are part of his project. So this is my first encounter also with that kind of robots, and we have been looking at how their performance also, when does their performance start to trigger interpretations of a character, for example, or of emotions of the robotic arm. But they are also all behind bars, so to say, because not because we're literally afraid of them, but also because of the risk of the robot not noticing us and being the risk of the danger that in its movement, because it's quite powerful.
We try to use some sensor, cover the arm, the KUKA robot with the sensor, instead of use all the time an head guidance, a human head guidance control, just to find a movement, a correct and effective dance movement for the robot. So maybe this could be an upgrade with the sensor system.
Yeah, I guess that would be absolutely necessary, because that's, I mean, the KUKAs are the types of robots that were not designed for social situations, so they were not designed to register humans, and that is also what makes it then something to take into account if you start, well, as you do, to start performing with them. They probably need to be able to register you, or to take to avoid that the risk for you becomes.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a chance for one more question. And I don't see any, so I would like to ask a question. I'll just jump in. There's one sentence you said that I wrote down is, this will help us to understand robots as having a life of their own. So do you think they are something like a living species?
No, I don't. I don't think so at all, but I do think, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm wondering. Now I'm wondering what the context was in which I said that. So I'd have to look back myself. I do think I am interested in considering what it means to acknowledge that they have agency, and that has more to do also with the kind of decentering of the human than that I would project a sense of a life of their own into them. I remember now, the life of their own. Yeah, that is the sense. That's a quote from Elisabeth Jochem, and that's about the binocular vision. This way in which we are prepared to understand, to take them as if they have a life of their own. That's and that would give them this sense of aliveness. I think that is a sense of that helpful in communication, but I would be hesitant to say that I would really believe that robots are going to have their own life of their own somewhere, or that would even be what we aim for. I think that's much more complicated, and I mean, I know that there is there is this attempt to make Android robots pass for humans, and that involves also, to try to construct interiors for them. I must say I'm then more on the side of Catherine Hales, who points out that maybe the next step of intelligence is not the copy of the human, but of non-conscious intelligence. And so if robots are having a life of their own, that will be in such a different way than we will be able to relate to. And then I'm not even sure if robots are the things that that more like computer systems are then perhaps more the things that we should start considering. But I'm not, I wouldn't say, no, I don't think robots have lives of their own in that sense, but I do think that the impression of them having a life of their own can be part of how they can be communicative or how they can perform a role in our social life.
Yeah, thank you. That makes it very clear. Thank you. So thank you for your inspiring keynote, Maaike, Blecker, and for all of you, we have a short break now, 15 minutes, and then the panel links are in the chat already. So I hope it's clear for everybody. If not, I'm going to be in this room for a couple minutes to assist if it's not clear. Otherwise, we'll meet again for the forum at 10 to 5. 10 to 5. See you there.
Gunter,
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. The second seminar panel, what is about? Because in the abstract, there is no abstracts about it, but I cannot find